The gospel lesson for this Sunday is from, again, the 14th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side of the Sea of Galilee while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning, he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord. I'm a history buff, and right now I'm in the middle of a great book, The Splendid and the Vile, by Eric Larson. It's a history of Winston Churchill's first year as Prime Minister of England, just as World War II was breaking out, 1940, 1941. I knew some of this history, of course. Hitler's race through France and through the Low Countries, demolishing those armies way faster than anybody thought would happen. And then he sets his sight on England. But this read makes so clear the incredible devastation of that period, the 57 straight nights of bombing, erasing entire cities like Coventry and its magnificent cathedral. And then the bombing centered on London, night after night, literally hundreds of bombers coming from Germany, dropping thousands of bombs night after night on London. The people would have their homes destroyed. They would go living in shelters, some of them just in squalor, dirt floors. They lived in great fear. They would, night after night, be listening to bombs whistling as they fell from the air to explode around them. And they expected an invasion at any time. And the Germans couldn't figure out why the British didn't surrender. But they didn't. The fear was constant, and yet they didn't surrender. Why in the world did they not surrender? Well, that's where this steely resolve of Winston Churchill and his ability in the midst of the very worst of it to hold out for the British people, the promise that the Germans would not prevail. Churchill was remarkable, and history has noted that. He was an orator. "We shall fight on the seas and the oceans. We shall fight with the growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." And the people, who had every reason to be absolutely overwhelmed by fear, were even more overwhelmed by the promise that Churchill held out before them. The enemy could not win. The enemy would not win. We will emerge from this. Promise, the power of that promise overcame their fear. Didn't eliminate it. They lived in fear, but they lived even more strongly in the promise. Well, fear is not a stranger to any of us. We don't live with the degree of it that the British did in that year, but we're not free from it either. The little fears that grab us and hold us are just as debilitating as fearing for your very life. We've been living with this hovering threat of the coronavirus for over 4 months now, and it shows no sign of going away. Early on, there were experts who said, well, when the weather gets warm, the infections will diminish, maybe pick up again when it gets cold. But the fact is, there has been no sign of anything diminishing. The numbers keep going up, and a percentage of those numbers continue to die. There's reason for fear in our lives. And those fears bring with it related worries. What's going to happen with our kids' education and school? What's going to happen with our jobs? Is anyone asking what the effect is on our national strength when we are spending trillions of dollars that we don't have in order to help people out during this time? Do I dare even go to a store if I'm at risk, and I know there are some people there who are walking around not bothering to wear masks and putting my health at risk? And even if we aren't living in fear because of the virus, even at other times, fear is a part of our life. It comes into our homes and into our lives. Well, this story from Matthew is a story about fear and about promise. So the story is there. Jesus has sent his disciples out on a boat in the Sea of Galilee after a day of teaching. A storm comes up there in fear for their lives. Those boats, remember, aren't very big. Jesus appears coming to them walking on water. They think they've seen a ghost. Jesus says, "Take heart, it's me, don't be afraid." So Peter, always the most impetuous, says, "Tell me to come and I will." And Jesus said, "Come." And Peter hops out of the boat and begins to walk towards Jesus. And then Peter takes his eyes off of Jesus and notices the size of the waves and the storm around him. And fear takes hold and he starts to sink. And he cries out to Jesus to save him. So Jesus reaches out and does just that and asks Peter why he doubted. It's a good story. It's such a good story. A lot of good sermons come from this story. There are some sermons that take as a theme the teaching that we ought to be more free to get out of the boat, dare to get out of the safety of our boats. Sermons encouraging us to take risks. There are sermons about always keeping your eye on Jesus, no matter what's going on, not about the dangers around you, but keep your eye on Jesus. It's a good sermon, and that arises out of this text as well. But there's one thing that I'm thinking about in the midst of this season of fear. Both of those sermons, get out of the boat, keep your eyes on Jesus, both of those sermons are a little like the self-improvement books that line the shelves of our bookstores. Do this, do that, and your life will be better. And there's nothing wrong with that. The Bible is full of admonitions about good living, how we are to live, the kinds of choices that we're to make with our lives. But sometimes there isn't a choice you can make, especially these days, that will simply rid us of fear. Nothing we do right now can rid us of the fear of this troublesome virus. We can take steps to stay safe. We can seek to conquer or to manage our own fears, but there's a limit to what we can do. The point of the story that jumps out at me is that Jesus did, in fact, rescue Peter. Peter doesn't just flounder because he takes his eyes off of Jesus, but because he grows afraid. And frankly, that fear is justified. It's a storm, for heaven's sake, raging powerfully enough to sink the boat, let alone drown a single person. He has, in other words, perfectly good reason to be afraid. And so do we. We have lots of reasons to be afraid. We have the fear of the virus, of course. We have other fears, fears of losing a fragile relationship, of loneliness after losing somebody close, fear of not being accepted, fear of how the next chapter in our life might unfold, fear of the future for our congregation's life, fear for the direction of our country, you name it. There's a lot of things that can make us afraid. And that fear is debilitating. It can sneak up on us. It can paralyze us. it can make it difficult for us to move forward at all. In response to Peter's fear, however, Jesus doesn't just encourage him to be strong or to instruct Peter to keep his eyes on him. Rather, when Peter begins to sink, Jesus reaches out and grabs hold of him, saving him from drowning, restoring him to his life vocation as a disciple. And I think it's that way with us. Jesus won't let us go. The God that we meet in Jesus is with us and will not give up on us, no matter what storms we're in the midst of. This is the promise that's at the heart of this story, that God will never give up, that God is with us and for us, and that God, in the end, will do for us what we cannot do for ourselves. In the Battle of Britain, the British people had great reason to fear, but they were also given great promise. They couldn't see how it was possible, but they believed it. And that's the nature of faith. Even when we can't see how it would be possible, the promise that God will reach out a hand and carry us along, that's our promise. That is the essence of faith. And that's the God that we meet in Jesus. Amen.